So, hey, Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us. Really looking forward to having our talk about your perspective as a product manager on iteration. So first off, what does iteration mean, and how does that apply to your role as a product manager?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I'm Jeremy. I'm a product manager here at GitLab, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about iteration. So iteration is one of GitLab's values, but I think it's one of the most important principles that we have as a product department here at GitLab. I think it means not only shipping the kind of the smallest thing possible and kind of making sure that we get customer feedback and rapid kind of feedback on whether or not they shipped the right thing, but I think it's also a principle that helps us move quickly, ship effectively, and work collaboratively, kind of like across disciplines. So I think it's actually one of the most important kind of principles that we use at GitLab, and it's really one of the foundational pillars that we have as a product team.
Nice, nice. And you talked about how it enables collaboration between different functions or disciplines. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, when you see collaboration kind of break down a little bit when you fail to iterate, because the scope of like what you're trying to accomplish grows. And as that kind of grows, then you have to, encompass the number of people that you have to pull to the table in order to get something accomplished also grows in tandem. So if you have like a very large initiative that, let's say changing like the something key and doing a complete revamp of like your onboarding flow, for instance. If you fail to iterate and you fail to kind of like scope that large task down, well, you're going to have to involve probably like design. You'll have to involve legal to like decide whether or not like the things that you're doing, or you'll have to involve engineering. You'll have to involve like this massive kind of scope of folks that'll have to have buy-in on this decision in this direction. But if you scope the task down to, oh, we just want to change the copy on this, or we want to just change this modal to like the experience there, then it involves a much smaller group of folks. So I think that what you see like a much higher level of collaboration, because the task becomes a lot less daunting at each individual step of the way. So if you iterate effectively, I think it increases the velocity and the amount of collaboration by just like reducing the amount of scope that you're trying to kind of tackle in every single kind of step. So I think that's what I've seen. And as a result, you tackle kind of more ambitious projects because the people that are involved are honestly not, kind of daunted by the task ahead. So the small incremental steps I think are really important when it comes to making progress.
Cool. And I've heard you say before that product managers are effectively prioritization engines or prioritization machines, something along that line. And how does iteration actually help you as a product manager more effectively prioritize?
Yeah, definitely. I think that we are prioritization machines. And I think that when you are scoping down problems, it becomes a little bit easier also to see the incremental value that they have towards a particular goal. I think you and I have talked a little bit about kind of local and global optimums kind of in the past. And I think that when you break things down to their component parts, it becomes a lot easier to see kind of whether or not they're contributing or not to like your end vision of where you're trying to get to. I think that iteration becomes really hard when you don't have a strong sense of where you're trying to go and what your focus is as a product team. Then I think it becomes a real challenge because you have broken things down to the point where they are so difficult to understand whether or not they're actually contributing positively towards your organization. But if you as a company decide, wow, like onboarding is really important to us because the top of funnel like is something that is so important to like our business. Onboarding is a huge part of that. And this particular piece of copy becomes like a really important like experiment or test. Then it becomes a lot easier to kind of see that incremental kind of like value that you're delivering. But like if you don't have that 10,000 foot view of what you're trying to accomplish, I think then iteration becomes really challenging. So I think that that's the thing that I think is really valuable is like in context with not only like a vision and also a feedback loop with your customers, whether or not it is like a strong like data-driven A/B testing system where you have like strong quantitative knowledge back that comes back for feedback, or you have like passionate customers like we do at GitLab that will give us like feedback through our issue tracker and through like lots of conversations that we have. I think if you have those two things, iteration becomes your best friend. But if you don't, yeah, it becomes a little bit challenging to make sure that that's connected to something valuable.
Right. Yeah. So one of the topics that we discussed on GitLab Design Talks before was think big, ship small, learn fast.
Yeah.
And that sort of frames that position of having the outcome oriented position tied to the vision, and using that as a context for your iteration, and then also using customer feedback as a way to.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. It's one of those things that's challenging to do in practice, and
Yeah.
I think that that's one thing that I think is something that you have to develop like muscle memory for, which is not only like writing down and thinking about success criteria when you first build something, but also making sure that you're following back up on those signals to make sure that you're on the right track, that you're actually following up on some of those success criteria, and that you're double checking to make sure that you're on the right path as you iterate. And that's something I see product teams struggle with sometimes.
Right. I want to tie back to something that you talked about before around local versus global optimum, or Optima. I'm not sure what the plural for it is. But yeah, I suppose within GitLab, we've been around for 6 years, something like that, maybe a little bit longer. Don't test me. But yeah, obviously we're not completely greenfield now. We have different areas of the product that are constructed in particular ways that customers may be used to, or we have maybe particular data structures that may not help us when we're trying to do new things. So we need to deal with some more of the nuance and complexity that happens when you have big things going on and things that customers are used to as well. So my question is, what happens when you found that as a product manager, you've built yourself into a local optimum, and you've got a solution which is useful and well adopted, but everything new that you build doesn't seem to quite get you where you need to go in terms of that broader vision that you're talking about. So how do you move from this local optimum where you are to like a hypothesized global optimum?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting topic, and I think that the first thing is that you have to know that you're at a global optimum, some like local optimum that is disconnected from like the global optimum. So like a lot of organizations don't even realize that they're at that point, right? And I think to me, it's defined by you have some lack of incremental progress towards some goal, and you don't know that that is the case unless you know where you're trying to get to, what that vision is. And it touches on some of the themes that I talked about before, which is that like you don't know what, if you don't know where you're trying to go, you don't know if you're there or not. And this could be something like performance, to say like, well, we can't build feature X at scale because we just, and that is of critical importance to like where we want to get to. We can't, like a company like Tinder, for instance, like when they first like had a vision for their product, I'm pretty confident that like their their founding team had a vision for like expanding that product around the world at the scale of millions and millions of users. And by nature of the user experience that they wanted to create, it has to be really snappy. It has to be performant. When people are swiping left and right, that has to be an experience that is immediately reactive. And so if they ever found themselves at an optimum where they weren't able to have an application that responded in like a certain period of time, then you clearly know that you're at like some local optimum that is going to prevent them from getting to their vision or their ultimate goal where they want to go. And they know that they need to redirect. This could also be something like a signal you could find is like a customer metric like satisfaction or retention, when you just hear recurrent themes from your customer base around certain things. And also you try to improve something like retention, onboarding, like conversion or something. And you just simply can't seem to do it given like smaller changes within what you're already doing. So those are the things that I kind of like think about when I think about like, do we even know if we're at like a local optimum? We reflecting on like the work that you and I have done, we know this anecdotally based off of like the work that we've done on analytics. We know that, GitLab prefers Postgres as its database of choice, and that has like trade-offs. And at this point is really hard to change. But we kind of just know that there is some like local optimum here that is preventing us from like moving like towards a global optimum analytics. We've never actually written it down, but it might look like something like, well, we need to be able to respond to we need to be able to query 50,000 different merge requests and have that respond with under a second or something. We've never actually written that specifically down. We just kind of inherently know that we're kind of up against some kind of performance barrier. But ultimately, like, we have decided that like our vision or our direction is that we want to be able to query hundreds of thousands of objects across like an entire GitLab instance and have that perform in real time. So there's clearly like a change that we need to make and some valley that we need to cross in order to kind of like solve that problem. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say around like how do you get unstuck. But for me, it's like, I want to make sure that we understand like, how do you even know that we're at this point? And that's it's all about kind of where you're trying to get to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think Tinder's an interesting example as well, because like in terms of design, there's some, like, they're the first people who basically made the card swiping interface. So I wonder whether there's anything you can think of as a product manager which sort of allowed that design, created the right environment for that design to actually happen, whilst taking iteration into account as well.
Yeah, and because they had this, they had this hypothesis probably that that particular experience was something that users would respond well to, that the number of interactions would be at this significantly elevated level as opposed to like the high friction kind of like interaction that was typical, where you have to like probably compose a message to someone. And so the number of matches that you would have like with any other product would be this very low level, but with this new type of way of interacting, it would be like 10x in terms of like what people like. So I'm sure that like they didn't like their first iteration of that product was not prepared for like millions and millions of users at scale. Like, they first wanted to test this idea to say like, do we actually have that? Did we actually see those types of signals? And again, I'm guessing that it is probably just in the number of users seen and the number of like matches that people like receive on like every single session, which I'm sure is like astronomically higher for Tinder than it is for any other product in the market. So they probably like went out in the market with that hypothesis in mind, tested it, said, wow, this is really working. And then underneath the hood, I'm sure there were many, many, many different changes and improvements that they made under the hood to make sure that they could get to that scale. But it all started with, we have this core idea, we're going to test it, and we see like the data come back and the response from our users that this is really working. So again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but if you don't have that like clear hypothesis in mind where you're going to market, you're not going to know whether or not it's working or not, and you won't know what decision to make.
Okay, nice. So I want to talk about another practice that we have within our handbook that we talk about quite a bit about in GitLab, of boring solutions. And I wonder whether you can give an introduction to boring solutions, just a little blurb of what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think about boring solutions in that I don't think about, so the word boring is always something that is a word that I've always had a little bit of a beef with, because I think boring kind of inherently feels negative.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's necessarily the intent of that at all. I think that the best way of summing that up is like, do the simple thing. My dad, when we were growing up, whenever we would have, my dad was an electrical engineer, and whenever we would be faced with a problem, I would reach for like the fancy cool tool that we had like in the garage or something. And his phrase that he would always say over again was just like, keep it simple, stupid. Like, keep it as simple as you can and find the simplest, most obvious solution to the problem. And I think that is a key tenet in product management. Define the problem and find the simplest, most straightforward solution to that problem. When at a previous role early in my product career, like, we were faced with the problem of user onboarding, users failing to come back after their first session. And I had this hypothesis that that changing the user experience in a certain way would result in people returning to the product a little bit more. And in not heeding the boring solution, which was to kind of make a small change, A/B test it, see if that worked, I decided that we were going to reach for machine learning and we were going to make this kind of customizable dynamic experience that kind of change. So instead of validating that problem first and then doing kind of the very simple thing, I reached for the complex solution, and it resulted in like a ton of tech debt. It resulted in like kind of like this confusing user scenario, which was really hard to understand whether or not it actually moved the needle in the right direction. So boring solutions to me, it's all about figuring out the simplest, most straightforward way of solving your problem, and just doing that instead of reaching for something more needlessly complex.
Yeah, I worked for in a previous job. I worked with an elevator company, a lift company, as a customer, and they always used to tell this story where, like, some of the first elevators, customers would get in, or users of the elevator would get in, they'd try it out, and they'd start to think, "Ooh, this is taking too long. 30 floors. This is like, yeah, maybe you could speed up the elevators in some way or another." So all these engineers sort of got together and just like, how do we actually speed up the elevators? How do we sort of do it with the pulleys and lifts and all this sort of stuff? And someone had the good idea of putting some mirrors in the elevator. And from installing some mirrors in there, people had something to do while they're in the elevator. So the problem space was sort of redefined from, we need a faster elevator, to we need something to occupy people's time so the time spent in an elevator doesn't seem so arduous, which is quite interesting.
I think I remember in some elevators, like the certain buttons, I think like open and close, don't actually do anything on some certain elevator types. There's just simply for your own edification, so you have something to press and make it feel like something is happening. You know?
Yeah. So having a good understanding of the problem, I think, is certainly useful when it comes to figuring out what actually is simple.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. So I suppose one last bonus question would be, as a product manager, how do you think designers could use iteration more effectively?
Oh boy. Product designers using iteration more effectively. I think that I think that the best designers that I've seen at GitLab do a very good job of balancing both the vision and what we want to accomplish in the future with small iterative changes. And so I think that we can lean into both of those more. Number one, I think that whenever I've seen like the vision for a particular feature or particular area of the product develop, it might extend like 6 months into the future. But I don't think I've ever seen at GitLab a really ambitious vision that extends like 3 to 5 years into the future of like what user onboarding could look like, what analytics could look like, what anything could look like. Part of this is, the nature of iteration, and the part of this is a nature of time. But I think that in an ideal world, because I've emphasized so much of the importance of making sure that we understand of where we're going, that we take the time to, maybe once a quarter, define like, what's the 3 to 5 year vision for value stream analytics. Like, what do we think that it could look like if we waved our magic wand and we could completely redefine or rethink the user experience for what people want to see. I don't think I've ever, we don't spend the time doing that at GitLab, and I don't think I've ever really seen us take the time to accomplish that. It's always like, well, let's take this small piece and let's fast forward 6 months, maybe, if we had, a couple engineers to work on this for that long. And then I think then the incremental changes and the iterations that we define become a lot more interesting and meaningful, because they can decide whether or not that they're kind of moving in that direction. And that's not something that, that design does in a vacuum. It's something obviously we do in partnership with product and our customers and engineering. But that's what I would really like to see more of, which is define what the real future looks like. Because I think that, that for some of these, especially some of these areas of the product where we do find ourselves kind of up against some like local, like Optimum, that is potentially like holding us back from the future. I think they can help us kind of put that in context, and whether or not we need to move in a different direction. Because when I think about a valley crossing, or like, what do you do when you find yourselves in some kind of like optimum state where you're like really struggling to make forward progress? There's like a spectrum of things that you can do, right? Like, I think that at the one extreme, where you have where you're trying to rethink like a area of the product or a problem space that has like so much inertia behind it that it is really, really hard to change. People will create like a beta or a new experience, and they'll just like run with two things in parallel. Some organizations will say like, well, like, it's risky, but we don't need to do that. So we're just going to A/B test, and we'll just do a bunch of experimentation because we have the scale and the data to make sure that's meaningful. And then some will, it'll be at the lower risk end of the spectrum, and they'll just simply like iterate on it or make like, more significant changes. At one end of the spectrum, you have, our analytics features, which some of them have low usage. So I feel like we can be relatively, agile with what we want to change, as long as we know what we're trying to accomplish, what hypothesis we're trying to prove out, and why we're doing it. At the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like, I'm trying to think of like a really large product that's been Reddit, like, which has had this new and old Reddit kind of like running in parallel for who knows how long, because they feel like it is such an important decision that they need to get right. I think that that's super costly, and I think that they're going about that slightly the wrong way. But I think that depending on kind of like where you are in that spectrum, kind of, but you don't know until you have a solid sense of where you're trying to go. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So I think at GitLab, when it comes to product development, we could spend more time kind of thinking about that 3 to 5 year vision, collaborating on it, and then creating iterations towards it.
Nice. That's a beautiful way to finish. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. See you later.
See ya. Cheers, man.
Ciao.